Okay, I think we do have a quorum. So thanks for joining us for our session this week. I think I'm enjoying this series and I hope the rest of you are as well. So next slide, please, Rick. Again, reminder, don't use any PHI. Initials are fine. Nothing else. Don't use first or last names as we go through our case discussions. Next slide. For assistance, you can contact Rick. For any sort of technical support, you can contact Claire regarding scheduling and related issues. And of course, you can contact me as well. Next slide. So today I will be the facilitator. We've got a really great presentation by Adam, who's going to talk about wearable devices and related devices as well. And Adam and Jim are going to be our discussants today for the two cases by Drs. Gordish, who's in the Ohio State, central part of the state, and Austin, who is closer to the southeast, sort of closer to the Pennsylvania border. Next slide. So these are our disclosure statements. I don't believe there are any new disclosures at this time. Next slide, please. And a reminder once again to use patient-centered language, patients with obesity, patients with schizophrenia, patients with diabetes, rather than using those terms as nouns, for example. And of course, these are some additional recommendations as well. And language is such that is associated with violence. Avoid sayings like killing it, pull the trigger, take a stab at it is definitely not recommended, especially on a morning like this. I don't know if you were watching the news, but there's been a terrible shooting in Thailand this morning of very young children. Next slide. So with that introduction, Dr. Perzynski, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to talk with you
You're
about...
muted, Adam.
Can't hear how about you now? Is it working now?
You're good, Adam.
Okay, good. I'm excited to talk with you about new...
I can't hear you.
Oh.
Gotham, yeah, we can hear him, Gotham. Yeah, I'll chat.
I can hear him.
Okay, please continue. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. It's not Gotham. It sounds like others can hear me. Maybe while Gotham is checking his audio, even though I don't have like a great view of everybody, many of you have your cameras unmuted, and I'm just wondering if you could all do me a favor and hold up your hands, like I'm arresting you. Let's see, pull your sleeves down a little. Yep, Kathleen is guilty. Jim is guilty. Oh, Deborah is guilty. Okay, so a huge number of you today, Brittany is device free, it appears. A huge number of you today are in fact wearing wearable devices, which is pretty awesome. Ebenezer, thank you. You put your virtual hand up, which definitely does not have a device on it. So I think because of that, many of you will be very, very familiar with what you can and cannot do with a wearable. This is a very, very brief introduction to the world of wearables as a way of promoting cardiovascular health. So let's dive right in. Next slide, please. So our objectives, I want you to be able to describe some ways you could use a wearable device. We're going to talk about different types of devices. And then we're going to talk about how some of the data from devices can and cannot be incorporated into routine care. Next slide, please. Okay, so just like on this call, many people love wearables. So the current number is a staggering almost 500 million devices will be purchased this year. It's a staggering number. And just to give you an idea of the ratio of personal wearables to medical wearables, I placed some of the data here. And one of the things that you'll notice is that we have way more of these personal wearables than we do like home blood pressure cuffs sold every year, right? So the volume at which people are consuming devices like the ones you all showed me on your wrist is much higher than other things. The other surprising thing here is that, you know, so wearables fall into a fairly broad set of categories. One thing I want to mention is the difference between a sports watch and a smart watch, as far as this distribution is concerned, is that sports watches are typically thought of as not needing a connection to a network, so that they're not connecting to your cell phone. They don't have like 3G on board networking, but they may have like all of those functions that you like a pedometer, GPS. They can be very sophisticated and do lots of things. So it's a somewhat nuanced distinction. And then everybody sees ear worn, and it's like, oh, are you just talking about like AirPods or earbuds or something? And the answer here is yes, maybe, but ear-worn wearables do all kinds of interesting things now. We're not going to cover them. And the same with the head-mounted ones and the clothing wearables. And we'll even talk about some that didn't make this list. Next slide, please. So if we're talking about the stuff, you know, most commonly we think of stuff that people wear on their wrist or their arm. The bigger one here is the Whoop band. Then we have like an Amazon Halo. The bottom center is like a Google Fit band. There's an Apple Watch, a Samsung band, a Garmin, and a Fitbit. And between the group that I have here, these are probably 80% of the ones that you will see. Maybe in different versions or iterations, but this is about 80%. But in terms of the range of pricing, for those of you who do not own one or who do not shop for them, they run from about $49 all the way up to $1,400. The business model of the Whoop band is especially interesting because they also charge you a monthly service fee. So you get to, with Whoop, you pay them more money every month for the cloud-based churning through of your data to make additional activity and health recommendations. And actually, I think a lot of the other vendors are moving toward a model where instead of just paying for a device every 1 to 4 years, that you would pay them a monthly fee for the data and app-based services that they provide along with the device. So I think that is rapidly evolving. And pretty much all of these devices require you or recommend that you have a cell phone, although some of them work pretty good as standalone, and I'm sure some of you have experience with that. Next slide, please. In terms of what these things do, any given device could do any or none of these things. But what the range of things that we see are heart rate monitoring, blood pressure tracking, sleep actigraphy in one way or another. A lot of devices now are debuting an EKG feature, which is really, they're not actually doing an EKG, they're sort of mirroring the function of an EKG, and they're doing AFib screening. Calorie expenditure tracking is a very, very popular use of these devices. General activity monitoring is probably the most commonly used feature on these devices. With the pandemic, we saw an explosion of SpO2 indicators. There are some of the devices now that use one of really 3 or 4 available formulas to create an estimated VO2 max that is generally just based upon data that you give it about yourself, your height, your weight, and then uses your heart rate information and some measures of your exercise intensity to determine what your VO2 max is. The algorithms here are surprisingly accurate. Some of them include route mapping to just like help you figure out where you went or where you might go. Blood glucose monitoring is quickly being deployed. And I will say more about that in a minute. And then body composition measurement, and that is what the wearable that I work on is most closely working toward. Next slide, please. So in terms of the things that the hardware uses to collect all of those informations, it's actually relatively simple. The primary piece of information for most of those is an accelerometer. So the most, and the one thing I would say is these accelerometers are incredibly accurate. Unlike some of the other things that the device uses, the accelerometer is hyper accurate. Like it can sense even the very tiniest of movements and track and collect data about even the tiniest of movements in three-dimensional space. The microphone is also often used as part of sleep actigraphy and can be used for sleep warnings and sleep monitoring, among other things. There are tons of optical sensors. I think on the prior slide, you could see the bottom of one, and that one actually has 7 different optical sensors on the bottom, like something like an Apple Watch usually has at least 3. Yes, that one in the middle there, like the Garmin, I think there are actually 7 optical sensors on the bottom of that one. We also use bioelectrical sensors where we send a small amount of AC current through your body and we take measurements. And then the last one, which is less common but occasional, are chemical sensors that tend to wear out, and we won't spend much time on that. And then lastly, people can also enter data that's combined with these sensors to get information. Next. Okay, so this is my device. We were recently funded, actually just like a week ago, to conduct a randomized controlled trial of a slightly improved version of this one that you see in the picture. So this is a wearable device that uses a technique called bioimpedance to determine how much water is in your body, among other things in your body. We call it, our code name is device that recognizes the need to intake water, or the drink device. We're using it on persons who show up in the emergency room with syncope or other dehydration related diagnoses, and we're studying whether we can help them recover. Next slide, please. This is coming very soon. Like, I think this is so the first article about this was almost 10 years ago now, but there is actually a commercial entity that exists that will sell you a version of an electronic tattoo. It's not actually a tattoo, it's actually printed onto you using an electronic printer. So they actually print the electronics onto the top of your skin. These are real things that are coming, so that you won't even need to strap it on. You can just have it printed on. Most of the printings only last like 6 or 8 weeks. The ability to use these things is really unlimited. They're quite frankly amazing. And then some of you may have seen the news about the group at Metro Health in physical medicine and rehabilitation, working with folks in engineering at Case and a big group at Michigan on the COSMIC study for an implantable device that will do pretty much everything in that list that I shared with, all of that stuff that was in the list that I shared with you. They're working to develop an open source, open technology standard for an implantable that does all of that. Next slide, please. So now to the really important stuff. Does any of this stuff actually work? And so the first takeaway is that sensor accuracy is generally worse than comparable clinical devices, with the exception of stuff that's accelerometer based. The accelerometer based things like step counts can be incredibly good and super accurate, but the optical sensors, the bioelectrical sensors, and even the chemical sensors, they generally, in most of the, and I'm speaking in broad strokes, but in most of the comparative validation studies, they do worse than you would do with a clinical device. So an example from my own work on body composition, the Samsung Galaxy Watch 5 and even the 4 about a year ago debuted a measure of percent total body fat using an approach that's very similar to what we use in our product on using bioelectrical impedance. And in their validation study, they say that the accuracy of the device ranges between 2.5% and 5%. So what that means is if you put one on and you measure your percent body fat and then you measure it again 10 minutes later, it might be off by 2.5% or 5%, which maybe, so that in their claims, they'll say, oh, it's 95% or 97.5% accurate. But what that really means is that it's missing how much fat is in your body by 5%, even within a 10-minute check. So sometimes the accuracy is not super great, and there can be a lot of hype and around a new sensor or a new feature that is generally just not very accurate. And there are some potential risks to taking some of those features too seriously. And it really is very much a a buyer beware. The one good piece of news is we have tons of RCTs. The systematic review data, and I've sampled a few of them here, is kind of awesome for these devices because there are many studies. Most of them have modest sample sizes, but there are some huge studies, 4,000 participants. There are many qualitative and mixed method studies, which are really very interesting. And then this last point is that the pandemic, regardless of how well these devices work, there's some recent evidence showing that we generally, as a society, have become more sedentary over the past 2.5 years, and we've drastically increased our use of wearables at the same time. Next slide, please. Okay, but as any of it works, slide 2. And the answer is like, well, this is like the best systematic review evidence ever. Well, about half the studies showed that they worked, and about half the studies showed that they did nothing. So what this evidence tells us is that, like, oh, flip a coin and maybe your wearable will have some effect on outcome. Next slide, please. There are some cool places. So if you dive really deep into this, you can see the stuff that does work. This study on peripheral vascular disease is one of the most interesting ones, where they gave people a Nike Fuel band plus an exercise prescription and some coaching. And then the other thing, the theme across all 4 of these ones that work is what I really wanted to communicate, which is that when an activity tracker or a smart band or a smartwatch is combined, or one of these other devices is combined with the things that we know are generally effective from behavioral medicine and behavioral counseling, that they can amplify that effect and be very effective. So that while on their own, they may have minimal effect, but like, especially this last one on the sleep study is really great. If in people with high blood pressure, if you give them a sleep wearable plus a smartphone app, plus weekly classes, plus telephone coaching, then their blood pressure goes down and they sleep better. Next slide, please. And then I'm gonna more or less end with this study and I think a visual from it. But the thing that is coming with these devices that is most interesting and I think most likely to be effective is embodied by this paper that is relatively new, where what they did is they took this relatively simple set of information: blood pressure, heart rate, sleep duration and quality, step count, speed. So stuff that pretty much all of these wearables collect. And then what they did is they trained a machine learning model to make predictions about what would improve blood pressure for each person in the study, right? So in N of 1 prediction, but collecting mountains of data on that single person. And next slide, please. And so this is like what the report looks like. So it's very complicated. I'm not sure you'd share this report with a patient, but it gives a summary of what their blood pressure was. And then, so this is the individual participant in the studies. It's the result of their random forest model, which shows that the most predictive things in the model were heart rate, which you would sort of assume, but also the speed at which they walked during their workout, followed by the number of steps. And so what the recommendation for this person was is that if they continue to increase the speed of their exercise by a modest amount to the higher intensity versions that they were taking, that they would see a benefit in their blood pressure. And in their trial, they actually found that there was a positive result of providing these subtle nudges that are based upon detecting what people are doing in their workouts. So I think this is coming. Whoop is really the leader in doing this sort of like in selling people devices that claim to do this right now. I don't think what they're doing is anywhere near as good as what they did in this study yet. But I think personalizing the sensing, personalizing the recommendations is coming in the next 3-5 years, and it's going to be awesome in cardiovascular disease prevention. What I would say is what you can see here is like interpreting any of this takes a fairly high degree of digital technology and health literacy, which many of our patients simply do not have. And so for that patient, this could be much harder. Next slide, please. And so if we're talking about this at the point of care, I've dropped a couple of links for you here at the bottom. The Metro Health one is interesting. And So these quotes from these venture guys talking about this are really awesome. Doctors would love to be excited about wearables. They're gadget guys at heart, which seemed a little weird statement. But their day-to-day is spent battling 30-year-old fax machines to get your last lab report. The doctors have little time for or interest in using wellness data collected by wearable devices. They don't want to spend money on additional and unproven clinical systems. And most of all, they don't want to worry about keeping the data private. So like all of those challenges are actually real. But despite those challenges, if you're at Metro Health and you have MyChart, you can link your wearable to your MyChart account today. Like you can go to this link and you can link whatever your Apple device is doing to your MyChart, and your doctor can see it. Now, I did an informal poll of everybody that I talked to over the past 2 weeks at Metro Health to find out if anybody had uploaded their data, if any doctors had seen their data, any data, or known that it happened. And then I asked one of the folks who's familiar with the data up there, and they said, yeah, there are a few people who've put their data in there, but to my knowledge, nobody has ever looked at it. So while this is a capability that we have, nobody's really using it for anything. The next slide, please. And I think that's where we're going to end up. So use of wearables is generally unlikely to cause harm for most folks. Some patients can experience frustration when they use them. Abandon rates are relatively high, especially in these populations with low digital literacy. So many folks will purchase a $300 device, use it for a month or a month and a half, and then they never bother to charge it again. This is a very routine thing that happens. It's akin to the same thing that happens with gym memberships in January sometimes. On the other hand, you do have a segment of diehard users who absolutely love their device, and we do have a pretty broad range of evidence that shows that wearables in combination with physical activity counseling does generally increase physical activity engagement in some populations, which is great. And then this area of making more personalized health behavior recommendations and giving people easy to use devices seems to be a really fertile area for promoting cardiovascular health as we move forward. And that's all I've got. If we have maybe a minute for questions or one quick question. Otherwise, I'd really want us to be able to have time for the cases.
Thank you, Adam. That was a great presentation. Just a comment. So Jim and I have run the Fit or Me program for more than 4 years now. I can count on one hand the number of patients who've come in there with a wearable or told me that they use them. And most of our patients are African-American and Medicaid recipients as well. So I think your point about the health literacy aspect of it is really, really important. It doesn't seem to be very popular with some segments. Any other questions for Adam? Go ahead. Sorry, Adam. I'm going to say.
I'm just going to look in the chat. Has anyone explored engagement levels based on this activity on social media like Strava? So actually, I will say, Chris, the mixed method studies that I referenced are completely interesting. And one of the things that they will find, even in diverse populations, that there is a boost to engagement. And that there is something about being very body aware with the device, if you haven't before, that for some subset of patients can be very, very effective. And some patients are very, very appreciative of gaining more insight into what their body is doing on a daily basis. And I think all of you have probably seen this similarly with use of a home blood pressure cuff or use of a home glucometer, right? So that there's a subset of patients who really genuinely value those readings and record them almost almost ritualistically, and really dive into incorporating it as part of their life, and that can be of tremendous benefit. So I think as far as like scraping social media, I've not seen that so much, but I do know that there's really a wealth of valuable engagement tools on the devices. And then the last anecdote I will say here, for those of you who do not use them, having a watch that while you're seated at your desk tells you, buzzes and says, hey, you haven't gotten out of your chair in 3.5 hours. It might be nice to take a 10-minute walk. Is like, so usually when it does that to me, I'm like, oh, son of a gun, my job is terrible. How have I been sitting here so long? And then I dismiss it, and 3 hours later it buzzes again and it happens again. However, I guarantee you that I'm more active when I wear that thing because of the reminder to move. And so that the immediate input based upon data that the device is collecting, and making a healthy recommendation can be super duper valuable to lots of people. Oh, and I got a direct question from Jeanette, and maybe I'll make this the last one. In your opinion, what are the best devices in terms of accuracy of reporting? Oh, boy, that's a loaded question. What I would say is that the accuracy depends on so many things. And it's not just the device, because it's not like branded. In general, newer devices work much better than older devices. There are some vendors who really pride themselves on the meticulousness and accuracy of their devices, and they make that known. And so they also tend to be the vendors that have they're going after a very specific niche market, which are health and fitness conscious hyper consumers who will buy a device every year at a very high cost. So oftentimes the highest cost, newest device is in fact the one that is going to report the easiest to interpret, most interesting, and most helpful data. So the $50 device can have some inferiorities. On the other hand, when it comes to the accelerometer in the $49 like Amazon Halo band, like whatever the cheapest one that you can get, is probably almost the exact same technology as the one in the $1,500 watch. There's almost no difference. The primary difference is in how that data is curated and shared back with the user. And so they may not have a great user experience in their companion app. So then what you lose is like, oh, well, you have less ability to interpret the same high quality, accurate reading. And so I would say like the major shifts often are in making that data into useful information that's actionable for a person. And this is really where, so Whoop is sort of like, they're priding themselves on this, and they're saying like, yes, we are totally doing this for you. We are gonna give you the actionable information. I think a lot of companies are very conscious of that now. But I don't know that for a clinical setting, like in terms of the data that you're going to get clinically, which one is going to be more trustworthy. I would say like I would approach them all with equal levels of eyebrows raised.
Some final thoughts and comments. Thank you, Danette, who has sent us some information about peer support in Columbiana County. And yeah, pedometers are dirt cheap. You can get one for probably $10 as well. So, and thank you for the chair exercises, Jim, as well. Okay, so I go two fantastic cases. I think we'll turn things over to Claire for a moment.
Sure. Rick, go ahead and go to the next slide. So Cardio has our quarterly webinar coming up in November. So we would love if you all joined us for that. Dr. Singh is a provider at Cleveland Clinic. She will be talking about COVID-19 and cardiovascular health. That QR code will bring you to the registration page, or you can go to the Cardio site itself, November 16th at noon. Otherwise, thank you again for another good week. We will see you all next Thursday. You should have the survey for this week in your inbox. If you could fill that out, we would appreciate it. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks, everyone. And we will have everyone have a wonderful rest of the week, and we'll see